Welcome to Unlimited Realities. I am your host, Lisa Zimmer, and I want to welcome all of you for listening today. I have a very special guest. I'm really, really excited to share his wisdom with you guys today. His name is, although he prefers to be called Jim, we are blessed to have our guest today, James A. Ocon, who has written The Lost Secrets of Maya Technology, James Ocon. And we are going to introduce him as Jim. So, Jim, thank you so much for being on our show today, and thank you for writing this book. This is a fabulous book with chock full of wisdom and insight, and I'm really looking forward to sharing this with the audience today. How are you doing, Jim?
I'm doing well, and thank you for having me with you.
Well, it is my pleasure. This has been such a great book, and, you know, we talk a lot about ancient intelligence, ancient civilizations, and many times we start with the Egyptian culture. But what I was really awakened by throughout your book was that many things in the Mayan civilization preceded the Egyptian awareness and knowledge. So I'm just going to start off from the basics, and we're going to build up here. But tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this book, because I did not introduce you properly. You are a professional engineer with decades of experience designing award-winning projects, and you spent 40 years investigating Maya engineering feats and lost Mayan technology. So let's talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this book and how it came to be.
I have to go back to my childhood. Here in Georgia, I lived in a small town outside of Atlanta, which is not part of Atlanta, and I played in the trenches that were dug in the Civil War inside of a battlefield called Kennesaw Mountain. And then we just, we knew what they were, but they were trenches, but we found rusted armament and spent shell, and we knew what the implication of the earthworks were, and that went on. It gave me a sense of history, and I knew that, we lived in a city, the only American city ever totally destroyed by war. Then that was another chink in the armor of history. I lacked a background in whatever happened before 1865. Went to high school and had a great history teacher who, rather than teaching about Napoleon and Charlemagne exclusively, he taught about lost civilizations, occult religions, and extinct languages. That really whetted my appetite, joined with my historic thirst. And I began reading the books of the great authors who had experienced or wrote about the conquest of America by the Spanish, Prescott and John Lloyd Stephens. So I went to Georgia Tech, which is a technical university, which doesn't teach much history, so I had to rely on my own resources for that. But I did learn world-class engineering, so I can marry the two. I happened to marry the two fields together, the history / archaeology and the technical wisdom that I was, well, it's not wisdom, it's a hard science, technical skills I was taught at Georgia Tech. And I began to work as an engineer. And after a few years, I took half a year off and bought a Volkswagen camper and took my family, myself. We traveled south of the border, down Mexico way, all the way down into what was called British Honduras, and it's now Belize, and stayed with in the local areas of the ruins, visiting the sites that were available then, which were very few that you could get to, that were tourist or had roads going to them. And I began to feel a kinship with designers, the engineers, the architects, the technicians of the Maya world that had built these beautiful cities of really terrific design with the carvings that were otherworldly and a special kind of structure that lasted in the jungle for 1,200 years. So I would ask questions. Now we're getting to the book part.
Okay,
of
because
archaeologists.
that was your passion. That was, it's interesting to me how oftentimes we're led down one path and we become very skilled at one path and then meander into our passions, and somehow the roads twist and turn together, and how Spirit and God just kind of blend those two right in sync for us. Because the exciting part, and we're going to get into this a little bit deeper, but you actually ended up discovering a bridge in the Mayan civilization that had been overlooked many times by some archaeological digs. Is that correct?
That's correct. The site had been explored since 1880, and the Maya civilization only been rediscovered in 1842 and disclosed in some books by John Lloyd Stevens, and became very popular. But very few people visited the area because of unrest. There was caste wars, etc. So a chap went to the site that we're talking about. It's called Yashilan, named Albert Maudsley, and he took photographs and made drawings of the site, and I was able to use those to do some of my research. But the site had been there waiting to be the part I was very interested in, which was the bridge, waiting to be discovered for, at the time, 110 years by the time I got there. So
wow.
That's one of my big skills, is finding hidden secrets that are in plain sight.
Well, and that was quite a good secret you unearthed there, Jim.
Well, it took me several years to get archaeology on board. Scientists and engineers jumped right on it. It was very logical. The city needed a bridge to get across that river to exist because it was in this huge oxbow of the river. And during the rainy season, 6 months of really heavy rain and 6 months of what's called seasonal desert. You could die of thirst in the dry season if you don't have adequate water. And this river was 600 feet wide during the winter when the rainstorms came. And nobody ever, even though there was two, nobody put two and two together, or 2 and 6 together, whatever it came up to statistically indicate the bridge. I put it all together and used, because I had to help with computers and 3D fly-throughs and stuff like that, and satellites and aerial photography, and pulled it off.
That's amazing. Now, in your book, we find out that the rediscovery of the Mayan civilization in the mid-19th century actually shocked the academic world, and it absolutely resulted in the rewriting of history. How did this happen, and why? Well, I mean, what gave them how did they grab the concept and say, okay, whoa, did we screw up? I mean, how did that happen?
Well, we got to go back to the conquistadors.
Yes.
They took over basically Mexico and the northern part of South America, and they forbade anybody. It was like during the colonial period, which lasted from 1520 until 1820, which is like 300 years. They almost forbade travel into the country. In fact, Protestants were banned from entering the country. They wouldn't allow any exploration. They didn't do any exploration themselves. They were not interested in the old cities that rumors came up from the jungle that existed in the deep rainforest, because there was nothing there for them to gain. There was no gold, no treasure, etc., and there was no market in pre-Columbian art at that time because nobody knew that this civilization existed. And in 1820 came, that was the independence of Mexico and Central America, and it was almost as bad then because there was a lot of roaming gangs and there was political problems, etc. So one of the elements that got John Lloyd Stevens, the first person that wrote a book about and brought out drawings of the cities, the ancient cities, he got a job as a diplomat, as a roving ambassador, as it were, to the Central American Republic, as this whole area is called, and they gained him access. And he had lots of interesting close calls with all kinds of bad guys, let's call them. But he persisted and wrote books about, and traveled widely, and came up with unbelievable, actually his partner, Frederick Catherwood, came up with unbelievable drawings of these exotic cities with the otherworldly art and unbelievable symbols that he conjectured were probably hieroglyphics, because he had already written books about Egypt, and he recognized the form of the language. The fact that there was a civilization that had high-rise buildings, that they had obviously a language, blew the minds of the world of archaeology, blew the world of history scholars, etc., that there was a civilization existing in the jungles of what actually was North America that actually created what turned out to be the science and their technology and all their wisdom in isolation. Actually, there was no outside influences, only the local, lore, etc., that contributed to their sciences and their technology, and that was an amazing thing.
Yeah, and there had to have been a lot of fear with the Spanish conquistadors to have taken all of these wise transcripts and books and record keeping and all of these things that the Mayans had accumulated in their development and their civilization. And they actually ended up destroying all of their written knowledge except for one book that was found, the Dresden Codex. Can we talk about why that book is so important and what was in it that we've been able to use as a guide today in our lives?
I will do that, but there are actually 4 books, and I'll explain where they came from. We go back a little bit. When the conquistadors took over, the Maya civilization collapsed for 600 years. But the knowledge in the books, and the books themselves, had been carried on by intelligentsia and priests or whoever was involved in being able to read and write the Maya script. And they kept, if you can imagine, these are paper books, so they had to keep redoing the books and copying the books. So the books that we found were copies of books that were originally carried out during the classic period, which was 600 years before. So these were copies, just like the monks in the monasteries in the Dark Ages. We owe our knowledge of the past to their copying of the manuscripts. This is like the same kind of thought process. So when they came, they being the conquistadors, they took, of course, we know about the Aztecs, they fell within a year. The Mayas didn't fall easily. The first attack was, invasion was driven off in 1532, but they came back and finally took over the northern Yucatan in 1562. Now, or a little earlier. But anyway, they at the time they came in, took all the books, considered them to be instruments of the devil, heathen, and they also had the Inquisition. The priests were probably worse than the soldiers, and they were pretty bad. And they burned all the books and just absolutely, I guess they killed different ways. The intelligentsia could read these things. They forbade the teaching or reading of the books, but somehow 4 of them escaped. Now, the Maya didn't go easy. We'll come back to the books again. It took 150 years for the Spanish to take the last Maya stronghold, or citadel in what is now Guatemala. It's a town called Tayasel. And it fell in 1697. 1697. We were already a British colony. Harvard, a great university, was 63 years old. I mean, they already had the Salem witch trials. Peter Minuet was running Amsterdam. It was like parallel with our history. So we're really connected in that way. But to the Maya, in a lot of ways, we could have, instead of having to break the code 300 years later, if somebody had any, if we had any power in the British instead of being the colony, we could have gone over and